VCC, go ahead, get skilled.
Hi, my name is Nigel Scott, and I'm the Interpreting Services Department Supervisor here at Vancouver Community College. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that you'll find it informative and that it'll prepare you for having a deaf or hard of hearing student in your classroom.
Introduction.
During this video, we'll explain how interpreters ended up in your classroom, the role of a sign language interpreter, and provide some tips for working with deaf or hard of hearing students.
Duty to accommodate.
VCC's Students with a Disability policy states that all academically qualified students with a disability are to be provided full, fair, and equal access to all college programs, services, and facilities. This extends to deaf and hard of hearing students. Before Interpreting Services enters your classroom, the deaf or hard of hearing student will have met with Disability Services to establish an accommodation for them. This accommodation is based on VCC's duty to accommodate students with a disability. The accommodation for deaf or hard of hearing students typically includes interpreting services with them in the classroom to ensure that all communication is interpreted and to ensure that VCC is meeting its legal duty to accommodate.
Interpreting Services Department.
As you may know, VCC has an entire department dedicated to providing communication access for deaf, deafblind, or hard of hearing students. This department is Interpreting Services, and we are under the Student Services umbrella. The first determination Interpreting Services makes is whether to provide your class with 1 or 2 interpreters. This decision is based on criteria set out by VCC, which follows both provincial and national standards.
Interpreting teams.
It's important to note that in order to provide an accurate interpretation, interpreters are required to listen to language, interpret what they're hearing in their mind, and then produce what they're hearing in a second language. This process, as you can imagine, is incredibly mentally fatiguing for interpreters. Often, 2 interpreters are provided to ensure that deaf students are receiving a full and accurate interpretation of what's being said in the classroom, and to ensure that interpreting fatigue isn't altering the interpretation.
Role of the interpreter.
The interpreter's role is to facilitate communication. Interpreters interpret everything they hear into American Sign Language and everything they see signed into spoken English. Interpreters remain neutral at all times and do not censor any information. It's important to note that interpreters interpret everything they hear to ensure that deaf students are aware of everything that is happening around them.
Interpreting meaning.
Interpreters interpret for meaning and not individual words. Please feel free to speak at your regular pace and note that there may be a slight delay between what's being said and when the deaf student receives the information.
Additional supports.
The interpreter is not there to assist the deaf student with anything other than communication. Additional supports such as note-taking or tutoring are not within the interpreter's role.
Prep materials.
We would ask that you please provide Interpreting Services with any classroom materials before the course starts. This material may be your course outline, a list of required textbooks, or any other material used in the classroom. This assists the interpreters in being able to fully prepare to interpret in your classroom.
Positioning.
Interpreters will sit or stand in a place where the deaf student can see both the interpreter and the instructor. Typically, this is at the front of the classroom.
Speak in first person.
Speak to the deaf student directly and maintain eye contact with them. Also, address the deaf student in first person. Rather than say, "Can you ask Bob how he's doing with his project?" you should say, "Bob, how are you doing with your project?" This will keep the communication directly between you and the student. I'll also note that interpreters cannot carry on a conversation and interpret at the same time.
Code of ethics.
Sign language interpreting in British Columbia is a regulated profession. All interpreters at VCC are registered sign language interpreters. They are also members of the Association of Visual Language Interpreters of Canada and adhere to AVLIC's Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Professional Conduct, as well as VCC policy.
Tips on working with a deaf student. Signing with voiceover interpretation.
Deaf people are no different than anyone else.
Astrid Evanson, Deaf and Hard of Hearing Program Department Leader.
What is important to keep in mind is that the students are individuals and that someone who is deaf is first and foremost a person. There are various degrees of hearing loss within the deaf community, ranging from mild to profound. While some people use hearing aids or cochlear implants, others will use no assistive devices at all. There's also a wide range of language use among students. Depending on their language preference, some students will use either spoken English, sign language, or a little of both. Not all deaf and hard of hearing individuals use sign language. If you are unsure of how to communicate with an individual who is deaf or hard of hearing, it is best to ask them directly. They will be happy to let you know what mode of communication works best for them.
Terminology.
Now let's focus on terminology. It should be noted that language, signed or spoken, is rooted in culture. When referring to students, it is culturally appropriate to use the terms deaf, deaf-blind, or hard of hearing. Terms such as hearing impaired or deaf-mute are inappropriate and offensive to members of the deaf community. As such, they should not be used, but instead replaced by the more appropriate terminology of deaf, deaf-blind, or hard of hearing.
Summary.
Whether you've had interpreters in your classroom before or this is your first time, we are committed to working with you to ensure that the classroom is accessible for all students. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and we hope that you found it informative. If you'd like to contact us, you can reach me at local 7518 or by email at nscott@vcc.ca. Thanks again.
VCC. Go ahead, get skilled.